It's good to see you all this morning. Thank you for taking time to join us, and I'm excited to have spoken word Eucharist, hearkening back to the early service when we didn't have music, and there's something contemplative and beautiful about this service. When I first moved to the Bay Area, summertime always confused me. Because it would be so cold and foggy in the morning. And in my mind, summertime, it's supposed to be warm, it's supposed to be, vibrant blue skies, and you just do stuff outside. And as you all know, here it's very different. And I would wake up and it would be overcast and like 55 degrees, and it felt to me like a cold November day, but it was July. And it was so strange to have that fog, and then I would just start to mentally be like, all right, I guess it's going to be overcast all day and kind of miserable. And then by like 10 or 11 a.m., the sun would come and burn off the fog, and it would be an incredibly beautiful day. But sometimes I would have just gotten stuck in that mindset of, oh man, today's just going to be a bad weather day. This is miserable. This stinks. Especially as COVID was here and you're stuck inside or whatever. And it's taken me a while. I've been here 4 years now to recognize, no, wait, just have some patience. When the sun comes up, eventually the sun burns off the fog and the day becomes bright and beautiful and amazing. Now I'm telling you all things that you already know, but this is a good illustration of Advent. Advent is a time when the nighttime is growing longer and the daylight is shrinking. And it feels like that nighttime is just going to go on and on and on. And it's hard to see the light. And it's a little bit like Advent is when we recognize that the world is not the way it ought to be. And we're hoping and praying and anticipating God showing up. We want that light to be present among us. It's like Advent is when we feel stuck in that morning fog and we can't conceive of the light piercing through. We're stuck in that fog of just unknowing, of grief, of sorrow, of frustration, of anger. And we're waiting for the light to pierce through the fog. And so the Sundays in Advent, the theme is hope and peace and joy, and then today we get to love. But it's also important because this is a time when it doesn't feel hopeful, peaceful, joyful, or loving. And now is a good time for us to be gathering and reminding ourselves, no, God is there. God is present. You're like, no, I'm stuck in this fog, and I can't get out. And in today's reading, we see Mary, who clearly has some kind of faith. And if you think of faith, it can be in good relationship with God, leaning on God in the times when the fog seems the thickest. It's when you're able to hold on to that hope, to that peace, to that joy, and to that love, when it doesn't feel like it's there. And Mary, from all we know, was a teenager, maybe 15 years old, and the angel Gabriel appears and says all these fantastical things. Number one, you're going to bear a child. Number two, this child will ascend to the throne of King David. And she doesn't ask anything about that macro level, like how will my son, because Mary, from what we know, was not important according to the social structure of the day. She wasn't of like a titled family, her parents weren't like a duke or an earl or a lord or this or that. She was just kind of unimportant and simple and was going to marry a carpenter. And she doesn't ask, well, how will my son become king? How will my son achieve this? But instead she asks about the physiology of, well, how's this going to happen? And the angel kind of explains, and she, obviously someone with great faith, in the midst of that fog of uncertainty, that fog of ambiguity, that fog of how exactly is this going to work, she's able to lean into the fog and say, well, I have great faith in God, and I know this is going to happen, and I know God will be with me. And she leans into that. And that's where that faith comes in. That's where she is someone of great faith, where she is leaning in. And in the midst of that fog of ambiguity, she says, all right, I want to serve God and be faithful to God in the midst of it all. Now, some of you may know, I found out on Thursday that a childhood friend of mine that I've known since I was like 5 or 6 years old, he's a carpenter and a handyman, and he somehow Tuesday afternoon fell off a ladder and he fractured his skull in 3 places. And when I heard about it Thursday afternoon, he's in a medically induced coma. And they didn't know, like, is he going to come out of this? Will he survive when he wakes up? Is he going to be lucid? Is he going to be good old Drew? Or someone completely different? And in the last couple days since then, he's kind of opened his eyes. He's not verbal. He's not very responsive, but there's a little bit of brain activity. But me and his family and lots of loved ones, we're leaning into that fog of uncertainty. We're like, oh, this horrible thing happened to our friend. We don't know what's going to happen. And we got to lean into like Mary, where it's like we don't have answers to a lot of our questions. But we know we love our friend, and we know we have faith in God. And so we're praying a lot, crying some tears occasionally, and not knowing what's going to happen. And that's kind of Advent. Advent is living in this uncertainty, living in this fog, knowing things are pretty dark. And Advent is waiting and preparing for that light of Christ to come. Like the sun coming and burning off that fog, the sun coming and warming your day, giving you light, giving you blue skies. We're waiting for that. We're hanging on to hope in the midst of that. And we know that in the midst of all of it, God loves us. And so the theme for today is love. And I'd like to think with Mary being the central figure in today's gospel reading, that in the midst of that fog, that uncertainty, like with my friend not knowing what's going to happen, he suffered this massive accident, that like the motherly love of God is like giving me a big hug, giving all of us a big hug, kind of rocking us and saying, I know, this is really hard. I'm here for you and I love you. And we're still hoping that God will show up and that things will be resolved in a positive way. But in the midst of that uncertainty, in the midst of not knowing, that motherly love of God is there, giving us that embrace and just rocking us and saying, I'm here, I know it's really hard, and I love you. Amen.